how sophisticated would you say are the efforts by intelligence agencies to influence global policies through media, social media, and if they can, an algorithm manipulation?
It's extraordinary. But I also stress that they're sort of downstream of the larger tectonic plates. Like, this is not so much a case, I think, of the intelligence agencies going rogue so much as participating in a larger State Department or shadow diplomacy or transatlantic push to do it. And they are simply deployed or moving up in their own careers by doing favors for favors. I mean, you don't make a lot of money at the CIA. The CIA, the head of the CIA makes less than $300,000 a year. The number two makes barely over $200K. You make more than that as a third-year associate at an average large New York law firm, where your job is mostly correcting typos and listening in on partners. You make your career in the CIA by doing favors for the larger stakeholders in the ecosystem. You know, when Mike Pompeo, for example, went from the head of the CIA under the Trump administration to the head of the State Department, that was a major, major promotion. When Leon Panetta went from the head of the CIA under Bill Clinton to the head of the Defense Department, that was a major, major promotion. The CIA is just a support group, and you make your career by doing favors for the larger players in the ecosystem, because only you are uniquely able to use the classification system and the plausible deniability and to do it and get away with it, because you are licensed to create, you know, the shell companies and the money laundering and all the things that would ordinarily be crimes if a civilian did it, but which are protected by the U.S. Justice Department when they're done in the name of promoting U.S. national interests through intelligence activity. And so you make your career by essentially abusing that license to crime, that license to lie that only the intelligence agencies are formally allowed to have. And so when you see this mass infiltration of Facebook or YouTube or Twitter 1.0 into the trust and safety teams to control the algorithms and to control the distribution of information, what you see alongside that is major power players from the State Department, major power players from the Defense Department, major power players from NATO, who are providing that sort of top-down policy directive. And the folks who are the intel people who go in and infiltrate are essentially just carrying out what the consensus vision on how to alter those policies are. And I can give examples of that if you're interested. But.
Yeah, I am interested, because I was going to ask you a follow-up question. And for people who don't know, at a super broad level, our intelligence organizations, by design, by charter, by doctrine, are supposed to be externally facing, right?
Right.
And you've talked about in some of your description earlier, you're talking largely about the difference between Title 10 and Title 50 authorities and how they blend, one being military authorities, the other one being intelligence authorities. I was going to ask you about your thoughts on how much, though, of people, they want to believe that our agencies are looking outward and protecting us, right, with a wall or a veil or whatever it may be.
Right.
I get very concerned, and I think people have every right to be concerned, because we keep finding instances of what you're talking about, let's say infiltration of social media networks, where these tools are starting to be turned internally, which is by definition and doctrine not what they're supposed to be used for. So I would love to hear some of those examples that you have of that happening, because I think it's important to point out that A, that's happening, but B, it was never supposed to be that way by design. Like, there's such a tight weave and overlap of those things.
Well, it's funny because, we started this section on the NED by talking about why an NED had to be created, which was because of the scandals of the 1970s, when the CIA was doing the exact same thing. They were operating on domestic soil. Mm-hmm. They were infiltrating U.S. college campuses. They were influencing U.S. newspaper organizations. They were, even things like MK Ultra were being run out of New York and San Francisco. But this is because, there's a few ways they justify this. The the most pernicious of them all, just to use our phrase here again, I guess,
I appreciate it.
Is that there's always been this magic trick to get out of the foreign facing restriction on intelligence by slipping a cute little word in front of intelligence called counterintelligence, which is this idea that intelligence agencies are supposed to face outward. But if you slip the word counter in front of that and you call it counterintelligence, you're allowed to do intelligence activities domestically on the homeland, ostensibly to stop foreign intelligence agencies from infiltrating the homeland. So for example, think about like Russiagate. Peter Strzok was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI. And how was it that you had the CIA, you had Misfud, and you had all these characters, whose what allowed such a sprawling? Why was the NSA, for example, able to read Tucker Carlson's signal messages? This is the NSA is an intelligence agency tucked within the U.S. military. Their military is not supposed to act against U.S. citizens. They're supposed to face abroad. Well, they can justify that under the word counterintelligence. Same thing with FISA. Same thing with Russiagate, which is this concept that all of the protections that Americans are supposed to have against the foreign firewall, the domestic firewall against intelligence activities, is when in order to protect Americans against foreign intelligence activity, we are allowed to spy on or take action against Americans who are suspected of being witting or unwitting assets in a hostile foreign intelligence activity. So if you are suspected of being a pawn of the Russians or a pawn of the Iranians or the Chinese, then the CIA can tap all of your electronic devices. The NSA can tap all of your electronic devices, can monitor you, can spy on you as if they were spying on a citizen in a foreign country, under the idea that they need to spy on you in order to spy on foreign spies. But the problem is in the process of that, they do what's called incidental bulk collection, which is that in order to see what you're saying or potentially communicating with Russians or Chinese or Iranians or Venezuelans, in order to read that, they need to read everything in order to be able to cull from that what is specific to their identified counterintelligence threat. So all it takes is one rogue actor who's reading everything they're now spying on you as if you had no constitutional protections. If they were to simply leak that to the press, as they've done hundreds of times in the past 4 years, if they were to simply, this allows you to put a target on your back, and now suddenly they have all the other predicates for a crime, everything else that you're doing. It's the perfect weapon for abuse. And this is not a new thing. As I mentioned, when I mentioned things like COINTELPRO or Operation Chaos or Mockingbird or any of these things, the COINTELPRO is a great example of this. A lot of people are familiar with what the FBI and the CIA did to Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. Well, Martin Luther King, prior to all of this, he was a controversial figure when he was a civil rights leader, but he ultimately ended up merging the civil rights movement cause with the anti-Vietnam cause. And when he did that, that was when the COINTELPRO ensnarement hit him. And the justification for the FBI wiretap and the FBI COINTELPRO activities against Martin Luther King was not his civil rights activity. It was that he was his primary sponsor was a guy named Stanley Levison. Stanley Levison was deeply involved in the Communist Party. He was alleged to have ties to the Soviets. And so the reason why when Martin Luther King was assassinated, he fell into the arms of a man that was later unveiled was actually a CIA informant. The reason by the end, all of Martin Luther King's inner circle were either FBI or CIA informants, was because he was being surveyed as under a counterintelligence predicate that he was being potentially backed by the Russians during the heat of the Cold War, because his financial sponsorship came from this Stanley Levison character. But that's all it takes to be able to create a Truman Show out of your life and have all your new friends be federal informants. But this is what happened to speech on the internet. And the first wave of internet censorship was not misinformation about COVID vaccines or about what you say about climate change. The crowbar to it all, the thing that normalized it, was the idea that we needed to have a censorship function to stop the Russians from being able to influence narratives. And this is what really solidified the connective tissue between Facebook and the CIA, between YouTube and the ODNI, between Twitter and the State Department, is this idea that we need to stop propaganda, and then any false news story that came from a foreign source was a counterintelligence threat, effectively. But that was sort of allowed in because how are you going to argue against a national security threat? If the CIA and 17 intelligence agencies all say this thing was real, and Christopher Wray is threatening to leave his new job as director of the FBI if Trump doesn't agree with this assessment, it was hard to stop that politically in its infant stages, in part because the Trump White House was not prepared to deal with it. It was something our country had never really seen before. But once that was normalized, it was just a hop, skip, and a jump to saying, well, we're doing this anyway for Russian-facing things. When Russiagate died in July 2019, they simply said, well, we've already toxified the concept of disinformation so much, we're just going to transition it to domestic disinformation. And when that did not generate lawsuits and prosecutions and political pushback for 3 years, effectively, until the Disinformation Governance Board and Elon Musk acquisition and the turnover of the House in 2022, that was really when, crap hit the chandelier.